She just wanted a glass of water. Nothing fancy, just water. But the flight attendant walked by them 3 times, smiling at everyone else, pretending not to see them. Her husband stayed calm. Her son stayed silent. For a while, what the crew didn't know was who he really was, and how fast things were about to change. By the time the plane landed, one quiet moment had turned into a full investigation. And the flight crew? They never saw it coming. Stay with this story. Every second matters. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you never miss a new one. Thomas and Leona Harris sat quietly in the wide leather seats of first class. Thomas adjusted his collar, still getting used to how much room he had. Leona looked out the window, her hands folded neatly in her lap, the soft light brushing against the edge of her wedding ring. This flight wasn't just a trip, it was a gift. Their only son, Miles, had saved up for months to send them to Washington, D.C. for their 45th anniversary. It was their first time flying in anything above economy. Thomas had packed his Sunday shoes. Leona wore a soft blue cardigan with pearl buttons. They didn't need much. Just a peaceful flight, a little comfort, and maybe something cold to drink. The cabin was calm. A few other passengers sipped champagne. Someone laughed lightly near the front row. A flight attendant with a neat blonde bun walked by without glancing their way. She smiled at the man in 1C, called him Mr. Barlow, and asked if he wanted a second glass of wine. He chuckled and nodded. She turned and walked past the Harrises again without stopping. Thomas looked down at the safety card. Leona leaned toward him and whispered, "Did they say when drinks were coming?" Thomas shook his head. "Let's wait a little. It's early." 10 more minutes passed. The same attendant walked by a third time, now handing out warm towels to the passengers across the aisle. When she turned, Leona pressed the call button. The light above their seat blinked quietly. No one came. Another 5 minutes. A different attendant helped someone find space in the overhead bin. Still no response. Thomas pressed the button again. A minute later, the blonde attendant finally appeared. Her smile was tight, her voice flat. "Yes?" Thomas kept his voice low and polite. "Would it be possible to get a glass of water for my wife?" The attendant blinked. "We'll get to you," she said, and left without asking another question. Leona watched her go, then slowly pulled the call button light off. Thomas reached for her hand. She gave a small smile but didn't say anything. The seats around them filled with quiet conversation. More glasses of wine, another round of towels, but no water. Nothing at all. Leona leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes. The cold air from the vent above her barely moved. It was going to be a long flight. Leona opened her eyes slowly. Her throat felt dry. The air in the cabin wasn't hot, but something about the silence around them made her feel warmer than usual. She shifted in her seat and glanced at the tray table still folded neatly in front of her. Thomas had turned toward the window. His lips were pressed tight. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way that showed, but Leona had known him long enough to recognize that look. He was trying to keep her calm, even if something inside him had started to bend. The same attendant passed again. She was pouring wine into tall glasses and offering them with napkins folded into little triangles. Leona waited for eye contact. It didn't come. The woman turned her head slightly to speak to someone behind them. "Let me know if you need anything, Mr. Dalton," she said, her voice warmer than before. Then she walked right by Thomas and Leona again, like they weren't there. Thomas raised his hand slightly, just enough to be seen but not enough to make a scene. The attendant didn't notice. Or maybe she did. She didn't stop. Leona pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and whispered, "Maybe we're not on the list." Thomas gave a quiet chuckle, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny. "We are," he said. They both looked straight ahead. A few rows up, someone received a hot towel even though the meal service hadn't started yet. The smell of warm food drifted faintly from the galley. Thomas's stomach growled. Leona reached into her bag and pulled out a single wrapped mint. She broke it in half and handed it to him. "Here, Just in case, she said. Behind them, a man was telling a story about his lake house and a broken boat engine. Everyone around him laughed. It wasn't that Thomas and Leona didn't belong. They had paid just like everyone else. But somehow, it felt like they were guests at a dinner party where no one had saved them a seat. Leona tried not to look hurt. She had been through worse in her life, but this felt different. This was slow, public forgetting. A soft kind of shove that left no bruise. Leona sat still, but her fingers kept brushing against the edge of her skirt. She hated that she noticed everything. The way the wine glasses clinked softly with each pour, the polite laughter floating in from a few rows up, the sound of heels clicking softly as the attendants moved past them like they were part of the seat cushions. She didn't want to make it a big deal. She didn't want to make Thomas uncomfortable. But something about this kind of silence made her feel small. Smaller than she'd felt in years. She looked at her husband. His eyes were closed now, but not in sleep. She could see the movement behind his eyelids like he was thinking hard about something. Thomas Harris didn't complain. He never did. Not when the heater broke last winter. Not when their neighbor's dog chewed through their fence. Not even when he got passed over for that school principal job 30 years ago. He had always said, "It's all right, Leona. We know who we are." And he meant it. But right now she wasn't sure it was all right. Because knowing who you are didn't mean others would see you the same way. Another attendant walked down the aisle. This one younger, dark hair, brisk walk, eyes on a tablet. He stopped at seat 1A and asked the passenger if she had any dietary needs. The woman, dressed in a beige suit and sipping champagne, waved him off with a smile. He nodded, tapped something on his screen, and turned back without even glancing at the Harrises. Thomas opened his eyes. "Still nothing?" he asked, barely moving his mouth. Leona shook her head. "Not a drop." She hesitated. "Maybe we should call someone again." Thomas looked straight ahead. "We did," he said. It wasn't just the water anymore. It was the way they hadn't been spoken to, the way their names hadn't been asked, the way the seat next to them, vacant, had a folded blanket and a sealed water bottle, while their tray tables remained bare. Every missed detail started to pile up in Leona's chest like small pebbles, and she didn't know how many more she could carry before they started to slip out. Across the aisle, a steward knelt to tie a loose strap on a passenger's bag. As he stood, Leona met his eyes. He looked at her, then quickly away. He didn't smile. He didn't stop. Thomas leaned back in his seat again. His voice was soft but sure. "You know, when Miles booked this, he said they were going to take good care of us." Leona nodded. "He even called the airline himself, said he spoke to someone who promised first-class comfort, said they'd do something special for us." Thomas gave a tired smile. "Guess that someone forgot to mention it to the people up here." Leona blinked slowly, her throat now dry not just from thirst, but from that quiet ache that came when someone makes you feel like a shadow. They didn't ask for special treatment, just fairness, just the same little kindnesses others were given without asking. A glance, a smile, a simple glass of water. Miles Harris sat near the back of the plane in seat 27F, wedged between a college kid wearing noise-canceling headphones and a woman flipping through a beauty magazine. He didn't mind the tight space. He had grown up riding buses with his mom, helping his dad fix the radiator in their old Pontiac, taking public trains to community college. First class was never the goal. His goal had always been something quieter, respect, stability, a voice that carried weight even when he didn't raise it. He had chosen not to sit with his parents on this flight for a reason. He wanted them to experience something nice without him fussing. They deserved this space. After all the years his mom ironed uniforms and his dad worked the night shift at the post office, they deserved to be seen. Miles had spoken to the airline personally and arranged for champagne and a small flower arrangement to be served to them once the seatbelt sign turned off. He even paid extra to have a handwritten card placed on their tray. "Happy 45th. You made love look easy, Miles." But now, glancing at his phone, he saw no updates, no delivery confirmation, no photo from the crew, nothing. He checked the airline app again. The anniversary surprise still said, pending delivery. His stomach tightened. He tapped the screen, refreshed it. Then again. Still pending. He leaned into the aisle to catch a glimpse of the galley, but all he saw was a curtain pulled across first class. His parents were on the other side, far from where he could see them. That was part of the surprise. But now, that surprise sat like a weight in his chest. Something didn't feel right. The man next to him tapped him on the arm. "Hey, sorry, just need to use the restroom." Miles stood, stepped into the aisle, then waited as the man passed by. He didn't sit back down right away. He looked up the long stretch of the plane. Row after row, quiet chatter, rustling wrappers, the soft hum of the engines. But something inside him pressed harder now. A voice, the kind he had learned to trust after years in federal service, said, "Check on them." He didn't want to cause a scene. He wasn't dressed to stand out, just jeans and a plain hoodie. He didn't even wear his badge unless necessary. But this trip wasn't about him. It was about his parents. And if something had gone wrong, even slightly, he needed to know. He stepped back into his seat, pulled his phone into his lap, and typed out a message to the airline's onboard support chat. "Can you confirm if the 45th anniversary surprise was delivered to Mr. and Mrs. Harris in first class?" He waited. A spinning circle appeared. Then, "Still in queue. Delivery will be attempted shortly." That made no sense. The seatbelt sign had turned off 30 minutes ago. He had been told this would happen immediately after takeoff. He stared at the message. His jaw tightened. He opened his photo gallery and scrolled through a picture of his parents taken just before boarding. His mom in her soft blue sweater. His dad standing straight, one arm around her shoulder, both smiling, both hopeful. He closed the photo, tucked the phone away, and leaned back. But he didn't relax. Not anymore. Miles wasn't just a son on a plane. He had spent the last 10 years reading people, watching what others missed, learning how systems either protected or failed the people who trusted them. And right now, he felt something had failed. He just didn't know how badly. Yet. Up front, Leona shifted in her seat again. Her knees ached slightly. The soft padding of the chair didn't do much to soothe old bones. She kept glancing at the little button above her tray table. The call light was no longer lit, but the feeling of being ignored still hovered over her like a heavy curtain. Thomas sat beside her, arms crossed now, his eyes locked on the seatback screen though he hadn't touched the controls. A movie played silently, subtitles rolling across the bottom, but he wasn't watching it. He was remembering. He thought back to the last time they had been treated this way. It had been years ago. A hotel lobby in Charlotte. They had stood at the check-in desk for nearly 10 minutes while two younger couples were helped ahead of them. When he spoke up, the woman behind the desk acted surprised, like she hadn't seen them at all. That same feeling had returned now. That slow-burning, familiar mix of embarrassment and restraint. The kind where speaking up could either fix things or make them worse. Thomas had learned over the years that silence was often the safer choice, especially when the disrespect was wrapped in politeness and carried out in public. He turned to Leona. Her face was calm, but her hands told a different story. She was rubbing her wedding ring in small circles with her thumb. She only did that when she was holding something back. "You all right?" he asked softly. Leona looked at him, offered a small smile. "I'm just thirsty," she said. Then after a pause, "And I think I'm tired of being invisible." Thomas exhaled through his nose, low and slow. "We paid just like everyone else," he said almost to himself, "and they still act like we slipped in through the side door." From the aisle behind them, laughter broke out again. The man in 3A, the one with the gray blazer and gold cufflinks, was telling a story loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Something about his time in Milan, a deal gone wrong, and a waitress who poured the wrong wine. The attendant, Samantha, they later learned, laughed with him, her voice light, high, rehearsed. She touched his shoulder briefly as she leaned in to refill his glass. Thomas watched. His mouth felt dry too now, but it wasn't from thirst. It was from the slow drain of dignity, the kind that leaves quietly without permission. Leona closed her eyes just for a moment. She didn't want tears. Not here. She had worked too hard, lived too long, carried too much to let herself break in the middle of a plane aisle. She remembered the first time she saw Thomas, at a church picnic in Alabama. He was carrying a tray of lemonade. He had offered her the first glass. He had never let her feel overlooked. Not once. And now, sitting next to him with her lips parched and her heart heavy, she felt like that simple respect, the kind he had given her whole life, was being stripped away, bit, by people who couldn't even say her name. They still hadn't been asked their names. Not once. Samantha walked by again, carrying a tray of drinks. Thomas lifted his eyes, made clear eye contact. She glanced, then turned her head as if distracted. She stopped 2 rows ahead to chat with a passenger about the in-flight wine list. Leona swallowed hard. "Maybe we should ring again," she whispered. "No," Thomas said, firm but not unkind. "We already asked, twice. They heard us." "But they didn't answer." Thomas nodded slowly. "Exactly." Their hands found each other in the middle seat. A quiet squeeze, not out of romance this time, but out of solidarity. Out of the soft, aching knowledge that once again, they were being reminded of something they never asked to be reminded of. That in certain spaces they would always be watched, but never seen. And somewhere behind them, a son stared at the empty screen on his phone and started to feel that same knot in his chest his father was now trying so hard to swallow. Back in seat 27F, Miles sat stiffly, arms folded tight across his chest, gaze locked on the back of the seat in front of him. His foot tapped a slow, steady rhythm against the floor. The flight attendant passed by with a tray of drinks, but he didn't look up. He didn't want anything. Not now. His mind kept circling the same question. Why hadn't the surprise been delivered? It was a simple task. A note, some flowers, a glass of champagne. Not even extravagant. But it wasn't about the gift anymore. It was about the silence, the gap, the pause where something decent should have been. He reached into the seat pocket and pulled out the airline magazine. Not to read, just to have something in his hands. He flipped through it without seeing a word. His eyes burned with something he didn't like admitting. Worry. His mother wasn't one to complain, not even when she had every reason. And his father, Miles could count on one hand how many times he'd seen that man lose his cool. Which meant if something had gone wrong up there, if either of them had been mistreated, they probably wouldn't say a word. Not until it was over. Not until they were in the car on the way home. That was the kind of pride they had carried their whole lives. Quiet, strong, heavy. But Miles knew better now. He had worked too long in his field, interviewing victims, reviewing case files, catching what others missed. He had learned how to spot patterns. And this radio silence, this missing confirmation, this tight feeling in his chest, it didn't feel random. He opened the airline app again and typed a new message. My parents in seats 2A and 2B have not received the pre-arranged anniversary gift. Can someone check, please? This time, the reply was quicker. Our team is currently busy with cabin service. Please be patient. He stared at the message. Read it again. Please be patient. His jaw locked. There it was, disguised in politeness, brushed in corporate tone, but unmistakable. Wait your turn. He had heard it before. Not always in words, sometimes in the way someone avoided eye contact, sometimes in the long pause before returning a call, sometimes in the way a room full of suits went quiet the moment he introduced himself and his badge. Not because they feared him, but because they hadn't expected someone like him to hold it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands steepled just below his chin. He didn't want to overreact. He wasn't looking to make headlines. But this wasn't just about a delay anymore. This was about something else. His mother had raised him on patience. His father had raised him on restraint. But both had also taught him there was a line. And when that line was crossed, you didn't yell. You didn't scream. You stood. You walked. and you spoke only when the room had no choice but to listen. His fingertips grazed the front of his bag. Inside, behind a zipper pocket, lay his credentials. His full name, his role, his clearance. He hadn't planned to use them, not on this flight, not for something like this. But now he wondered what his parents were sitting through in silence. And that thought alone made him reach for the zipper. Not to flash authority, not to embarrass anyone, but to remind whoever had forgotten that Thomas and Leona Harris were not invisible. Not to him, and not anymore. In seat 2A, Leona sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her fingers now stiff from holding them together for so long. She didn't trust them to stay still anymore. Not after the last time the flight attendant passed and didn't even look at her. Her throat still felt dry, but now it wasn't just from thirst. It was from the way she'd swallowed her voice again and again. She wasn't sure when that had started, this habit of making herself smaller in places where she should have been allowed to take up space. Maybe years ago, maybe always. She turned to Thomas. He hadn't spoken in a while. He sat upright, legs crossed, eyes forward, but she could feel the tension in him. It was there in the way he adjusted his cuff again, even though it didn't need fixing, in the way his jaw flexed every few seconds. Leona whispered, "You want me to press the button again?" Thomas didn't answer right away. Then calmly, "No. They know we're here." Leona nodded. Her eyes drifted down the aisle. Samantha, the flight attendant, was now standing near seat 1A, chatting with a man who had barely even glanced at them since boarding. He was laughing, leaning slightly in, one elbow propped on the armrest, a glass of red wine in his hand. Samantha laughed too, touched his wrist lightly, and said something Leona couldn't hear, but she could tell it was light, casual, familiar. Like they'd known each other, like it was easy. Then Leona caught it. Samantha reached into the front cabinet and pulled out a small box with a silver bow. She handed it to the man in 1A. Leona blinked. Her heart dropped just a little. It was supposed to be them. She was sure of it now. That was their surprise. Leona turned to Thomas. "Did you see that?" she asked, voice low. Thomas gave a single nod. "Yeah." They didn't say anything else for a long time. The cabin felt colder now. Not the air, something else. Like a window had been opened inside her chest and everything warm was seeping out. And then it hit her. Miles. Miles had planned something. She remembered how he hugged her before boarding, how he adjusted her cardigan on her shoulders and said, "Just relax. I want you to enjoy every second. You'll know it when it happens." She had smiled and teased him, but deep down she felt that warmth in his voice. Her boy, always thoughtful, always watching. But nothing had happened, not even a glass of water. And the worst part wasn't the thirst or the disappointment. It was wondering if Miles thought they'd received it. Leona's heart sank deeper. She hated the idea of him smiling in the back, thinking they were sipping champagne and being celebrated, while in reality, she was biting her tongue and blinking back tears. She pictured him checking his phone, maybe proud of the gesture. She pictured his face when he would later find out nothing happened. No card, no flowers, no recognition. Thomas shifted in his seat and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a mint wrapped in crinkly paper. He placed it in her hand without a word. She looked at it, then him. He didn't smile. She unwrapped it carefully and popped it in her mouth. It was dry and stale, but cold. It helped. Just a little. Behind them, the sound of another glass being filled with ice echoed, followed by laughter. Leona leaned her head against the seat and stared at the ceiling. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want to make a fuss. She just wanted her son to know that he had tried to give them something beautiful, and that someone else had decided they didn't deserve it. And that, more than the dry throat or the missing tray, was what hurt the most. Miles stood now. Not fast, not in anger, just slow and deliberate like he was stepping out of a memory. He smoothed the front of his hoodie and looked down the aisle. The curtain that separated first class from coach hung straight and still. It looked soft, but to him it felt like a wall, one that had been there his whole life in different forms. Grocery stores, boardrooms, college classrooms, and now, a flight his parents were supposed to enjoy. He looked around before stepping into the aisle. A few heads turned. A flight attendant toward the back noticed him but said nothing. He made his way forward, passing tray tables, bags under seats, passengers halfway into naps or conversations. Nobody stopped him. As he reached the front of coach, the curtain came closer. He hesitated for half a second. Not out of fear. He didn't fear much anymore. But out of restraint. He had been raised with it, taught to use it like armor. His parents had raised him on patience and manners, to wait, to ask nicely, to believe that if you did things the right way, people would meet you halfway. But what happens when they don't? He stepped forward, just enough to push the curtain aside, and came face to face with the same blonde flight attendant who had ignored his parents. She blinked, surprised. "Sir, this section is for first-class passengers only." Miles held up his wallet, flipped it open. His badge sat inside, clean and sharp. The gold edges caught the cabin light. "Special Agent Miles Harris, FBI," he said, his voice even. "My parents are seated in 2A and 2B. I'm going to speak with them now." Her mouth stayed open for a second longer than it should have. She wasn't prepared for that. Not the badge, not the tone, not the fact that the man standing in front of her was the quiet one she hadn't noticed in the back. She stepped to the side without another word. Miles didn't rush. He walked slowly, carefully, like every step was made of stone. He passed passengers who now watched with sudden interest. Some turned their heads, others stared outright. They had no idea what was happening, but they knew enough to stop talking. He reached row 2. His mother saw him first. Her eyes widened. She looked confused at first, then her mouth parted just slightly, not in greeting but in worry. Miles bent down, his knees creaking slightly as he crouched beside her seat. She touched his arm. "Miles." "What? What's wrong?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at her face, then at Thomas, who sat upright and silent, hands folded neatly in his lap. His father gave him a small nod, barely there, like a silent confirmation. Yes. It happened. And yes, we stayed quiet. Miles looked at the tray in front of them. Nothing. No water. No sign of celebration. Not even basic service. Just an untouched napkin and a sealed menu no one had opened for them. He turned back to his mother. "They never brought the surprise, did they?" Leona's eyes blinked quickly. She opened her mouth, closed it again. She didn't want to make him feel bad. She didn't want to ruin the one thing he tried to give. "No," she said gently. "But it's okay." Miles shook his head. "It's not." Leona leaned in, whispering low, "Please don't make a scene. We're all right." He looked at her, and for a moment the strong, composed agent faded. Behind his eyes was the same boy who had once hidden in her lap during thunderstorms. The boy who once cried when a teacher called him too much. The boy who had learned to stay quiet before anyone asked him to. But that boy had grown into a man who now saw patterns in silence. Miles stood up slowly, not to confront, not to threaten, but to bear witness, because silence had carried too much weight in their lives already. And he knew that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was show up when they never expected you to stand. Samantha stood frozen near the galley door, arms stiff at her sides, eyes flicking toward the row where Miles now stood upright, his height making him more visible than she would have liked. Something about him had shifted the air in the cabin. The laughter from the front row had stopped. The clinking of glasses seemed louder than before. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone had gone quiet, waiting. She swallowed hard and turned her back, busying herself with rearranging trays that didn't need fixing. She knew she had messed up somewhere, not in a way that would make headlines, but in a way that could stain. The kind of mess-up that couldn't be smoothed with an apology or tucked under professional charm. She had dismissed 2 elderly passengers, gently, politely, but completely. And now the man standing in front of them had credentials she couldn't ignore. Miles looked down at his father. Thomas didn't move, but his eyes met his son's. They didn't ask for help. They didn't want a rescue, but they allowed his presence. That was enough. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone. He tapped open the airline app again and took a slow breath. Then he opened the camera. Quietly, he snapped a photo of the untouched tray table, the empty cup holder, the sealed towel packet left at an angle. These weren't dramatic images, but he wasn't collecting drama. He was collecting patterns, just like he had been trained to. He leaned slightly and whispered to his father, "I need to speak to the flight lead." Thomas gave the smallest nod, but his lips stayed pressed together. Not from fear, from weariness. Leona glanced up, her eyes glistening. "Miles, baby, just leave it be. We're all right now that you're here." But he couldn't leave it be. That was the problem. That's what the system always wanted, for people like his parents to leave it be, to take the mistreatment quietly, to walk off planes and out of restaurants and down sidewalks telling themselves, "It's not worth it. Don't cause trouble, don't be the angry one." But Miles wasn't angry, not loudly anyway. He was focused. He straightened up and walked slowly toward the galley. Samantha turned when she heard his steps. Her eyes flicked toward the badge clipped inside his wallet, still visible. Her smile returned, but it had changed, tight, strained, artificial. "Is there something I can help you with, sir?" she asked, her voice light but no longer relaxed. "Yes," Miles said simply. "I'd like to speak to the flight supervisor. Immediately." Her lips parted, but no sound came at first. She looked behind her, then at her colleague across the aisle, who quickly busied himself with folding napkins. May I ask what this is concerning?" she asked. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't change his tone. "I'm addressing a service discrimination concern. 2 passengers in 2A and 2B. It involves denied amenities, failed delivery of prearranged services, and observed unequal treatment based on race and perceived class." The words were clinical, cold but exact. His eyes didn't move from hers. Samantha's shoulders dropped by a fraction. She turned and hurried into the small crew prep area, where she whispered something to the senior flight attendant, an older man with silver hair and a calm face. He emerged a moment later, wiping his hands on a towel. "Sir," he said, walking up to Miles, "I'm the cabin supervisor. Can we speak privately?" Miles nodded, stepped to the side but didn't move far. He wanted his parents within view. This wasn't a case to be filed later. It was happening now, and the evidence was still warm. He spoke evenly. "My name is Special Agent Miles Harris. My parents are seated in 2A and 2B. They are diamond-level customers. They were denied water. They were ignored multiple times. They never received their prearranged celebration package despite confirmed delivery status. Meanwhile, I've observed multiple examples of attentive service to passengers around them, including drink refills, meal preference confirmations, and multiple verbal check-ins." The supervisor blinked. He didn't look surprised, but he did look cornered. "I see," he said quietly. "I'll look into it immediately. I'm sorry." Miles held up a hand. "Don't say that to me, say it to them. Not because it's polite, but because it's overdue." The supervisor's face shifted. He walked back down the aisle toward Thomas and Leona. Miles followed behind, slow and silent. Leona looked up as the man approached. She sat up straighter, suddenly unsure. Her fingers gripped the edge of her armrest. Thomas didn't move. He just stared ahead. "I'd like to apologize for the experience you've had on this flight," the supervisor began. "There's no excuse for what's happened. We are addressing the service failure immediately." Leona nodded once. "We didn't ask for much," she said. "Just a glass of water." Thomas didn't speak, but his eyes held steady, like a man who had heard a lot of apologies in his life and knew the difference between habit and truth. The supervisor turned and walked away. Miles stayed a moment longer, crouched again between their seats. "I wasn't going to say anything," Leona whispered, her voice barely holding steady. "We didn't want to ruin the day." Miles smiled at her gently. "You didn't. They did." She reached for his hand. Her grip was firmer than expected, and in her eyes he saw it. Gratitude, sadness, and something else. Relief. Relief that someone had spoken, that someone hadn't walked past the curtain, that someone finally had not left it be. The cabin had changed. It was quiet now in a way that didn't feel peaceful. It felt tense, stretched, like the whole room was holding its breath. Conversations had thinned into whispers. Heads tilted subtly, pretending not to watch but listening all the same. The overhead lights flickered slightly as the plane leveled mid-air, and in the silence, the hum of the engine became louder, the softest clinks of glassware suddenly more noticeable than ever. Leona sat upright again. Her back ached, but she didn't shift. She didn't want to appear ungrateful, not now, not while all eyes seemed to linger in their direction, curious but not caring. She gently brushed a wrinkle from her cardigan, not because it mattered, but because it gave her something to do with her hands. She hated being the center of attention, especially like this. She looked at Miles. Her son had returned to his seat beside her, badge tucked away, hoodie back in place. His hands were folded in his lap, calm, still, too still. She knew that look. That was the same face he wore when his grandfather passed, when he read the newspaper in high school about a man who was shot for reaching into his own car. It wasn't anger. It was the space between emotions, the waiting place where words didn't come, just wait. "I didn't want this to happen," she whispered to him. Miles turned his head slightly. "Neither did I." Thomas remained still, arms crossed again, but his grip was tighter now. He was a man who had spent 5 decades mastering control. When someone at the bank double-checked his signature, when a neighbor asked if he really lived in the White House on the corner, when a parent at his old school said, "You people are always so strict." He had swallowed each moment like dry stones, painful but familiar. This one, however, stung differently, because this time someone had watched it happen. Their son had seen it all unfold, and Thomas wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. "I was worried you'd be embarrassed," he said quietly, eyes still forward. Miles looked over, confused. Thomas glanced at him. "That you'd feel like we didn't stand up for ourselves." Miles shook his head slowly. "I wasn't embarrassed by you. I was disappointed in them." Thomas's chest rose, then fell. That answer held more weight than Miles knew. Meanwhile, the supervisor returned, this time with a small silver tray. On it sat 2 crystal glasses filled with chilled, sparkling water, each garnished with a thin lemon slice. A folded white napkin rested beneath each one. Miles glanced at the tray, then back at the supervisor. The man looked smaller now. Not physically, but inwardly. His shoulders didn't sit as high. His eyes didn't dance with polished ease. He held the tray like it was heavier than it should have been. "I wanted to personally bring this to you," he said to Leona and Thomas. "It's overdue, and I deeply regret that it took so long." Thomas took the glass gently. "Thank you." Leona followed, her voice softer. "We appreciate it." The man lingered a moment longer, then bowed his head and stepped away. The water was cold, clear, and crisp. Leona took a slow sip. It wasn't just refreshing, it was grounding. Like her body had been holding its breath along with the cabin, and now finally, it could exhale. But the hurt didn't disappear with hydration. It never did. Miles watched her. He knew what she was thinking. He'd seen it in victims too many times, that complicated mix of being relieved someone finally did the right thing, and being wounded that they didn't do it sooner. Because the damage had already been done. It had crept in quietly through the silence, through every moment of being overlooked, through every pass of the cart that didn't stop, through every name that was never asked. Samantha passed by again. This time she didn't look away. She offered a small nod. Too late, too careful. And Leona, out of habit more than kindness, nodded back. Not because she forgave her, but because she refused to be bitter. That was the difference between them. Thomas leaned toward Miles now. His voice was low, controlled, but laced with something deeper. "We taught you to work hard," he said. "To be good, to be fair. And I wonder sometimes if we made it too easy for others to stay comfortable while we stayed quiet." Miles didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, the clouds passing beneath like slow-moving ghosts. "No," he finally said. "You taught me how to survive with dignity. But I was always going to learn when to stop letting dignity mean silence." Thomas gave a small nod. His eyes didn't glisten, but they carried something close. Leona reached into her bag, pulled out a tissue, and dabbed her eyes before any tear could fully form. Outside the window, the sky had begun to shift into early evening. The sun touched the edge of the clouds with a warm gold. The plane moved steady across the horizon, but inside seat 2A and 2B, something else had moved too. A quiet, careful shift that couldn't be seen on any flight map. A turning, and somewhere deeper behind quiet breaths and folded hands, a mother and father realized that their son hadn't just grown into a good man. He had become the kind of man who knew when not to wait for permission. The next hour moved slowly, not in the dragging way of a dull flight, but in the way time bends when something has already happened, and everyone's trying to act like it hasn't. Leona sat with her hands wrapped gently around her glass. The water was half gone, but she held it like it meant more than hydration. It had taken nearly 3 hours, and the presence of her son's badge to receive what other passengers were given in minutes. That knowledge didn't go away. It stayed, heavy and quiet, in her chest, like a bruise that hadn't yet turned purple. She stared out the window for a while. The clouds below looked peaceful, soft, like cotton laid out over glass. A long, steady stretch of sky that reminded her of Sunday drives through the country when she was a girl. She'd always loved silence then. The hush of trees, the hum of old roads. But this silence wasn't the same. This silence felt like a hush forced upon her, like a lid pressed down too long. Across the aisle, the man in 1C was still sipping red wine. He hadn't spoken since Miles came forward. His laughter had stopped. His feet, once spread wide, now sat squarely under his seat. Even his posture had changed, like someone who'd realized the room wasn't built for just his voice after all. Thomas had taken out a small paperback from his coat pocket. He wasn't reading it, just holding it, fingers resting between the pages as if to say he could dive in if he wanted. But right now, he didn't want to escape. He wanted to be present, to bear witness. Miles, now sitting in the empty aisle seat next to his mother, had gone quiet too. His legs were crossed, one hand resting on his knee, the other on the armrest. He hadn't taken his badge back out, but it might as well have still been there. The authority didn't come from the leather or the metal. It came from the fact that he had used it, calmly, precisely, without needing to raise his voice. That was what struck Leona most. Not the uniform, not the title, but how steady he had stayed in the middle of a situation that made her want to disappear. She turned to him, voice barely above a whisper. "You know, when you were a boy, I always worried the world would make you loud, that it would try to harden you." Miles glanced over, brows slightly raised. "Did it?" "No," she said. "It made you sharp, not loud, sharp like a needle, quiet but exact." Miles didn't answer right away. He let the words settle. They meant more than she probably realized. Because for years he had felt pressure, spoken and unspoken, to be polite even when wronged, to be calm even when ignored, to be professional even when others weren't. And yet here he was, grown, controlled, and still able to cut through the noise when it mattered. A different flight attendant approached now, an older black woman named Yvette. Her hair was pulled back into a bun, and her face was kind but reserved, like someone who had learned not to show all her cards at once. She leaned slightly toward Leona. "Mrs. Harris, I'm so sorry. I wasn't working your section, but I just wanted to say, we should have done better by you. I'm not here to offer excuses, just respect." Leona blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Yvette smiled gently, then looked at Thomas. And, Mr. Harris, if there's anything you need, anything at all, I'll make sure you get it. Thomas nodded. Just honesty, he said. That's enough. Yvette looked at Miles, then gave a small nod of understanding. A quiet exchange passed between them. One black professional to another. No badge, no titles, just recognition. As Yvette walked away, Leona exhaled slowly. The kind of breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding in for hours. You think this'll make a difference, she asked. Miles considered the question, not just in terms of the flight, but in a broader, deeper way, in the way systems change or don't. Maybe not for everyone, he said, but maybe next time someone like you doesn't have to wait 3 hours for water. Maybe next time they hesitate before they dismiss someone who looks like you. Maybe that's how it starts. Thomas closed his book gently, fingers still resting on the cover. I used to think if we just stayed quiet and worked hard, the world would eventually catch up, he said. Now I think the world only moves when it's pushed, kindly, firmly, but pushed. Leona reached over and placed her hand over both of theirs. Her fingers were warm again, steady. Outside the window, the sky had begun to shift into soft evening blues. Below, the clouds thinned. Land came into view, small patches of green and gold and gray, the way cities and roads do when you're too high up to hear the noise but close enough to see the shapes. They were still in the air, but something in them had already landed. A quiet, powerful awareness that the flight would end soon, but this moment would not. The seatbelt sign dinged softly above them. The intercom crackled as the captain's voice came through, smooth and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent shortly. Please return to your seats, fasten your belts, and stow any loose items. Cabin crew, prepare for arrival. Leona reached for her handbag and tucked it gently beneath the seat. Her fingers lingered on the strap longer than needed. She wasn't in a hurry. Part of her wanted the flight to end, but another part, the heavier part, didn't want to walk off pretending this was just another trip. Something had changed in the air between them, between her and the world. Across from her, Thomas fastened his belt and shifted slightly, the way older men do when their backs ache and their pride sits a little stiffer in the spine. His eyes stayed forward, but his mind was turning over everything that hadn't been said out loud. He thought about how quickly respect was given to others, how easily people like him were mistaken for background, and how exhausting it was, year after year, decade after decade, to carry yourself with dignity, only for someone to treat you like they forgot you existed. Miles adjusted in his seat beside them, pulling his badge wallet from his pocket one last time and tucking it carefully back into his carry-on. He didn't need it anymore. He had already done what needed to be done. But even now, with the confrontation past and the apology delivered, he felt something unfinished inside. Not rage, not even bitterness. Just that familiar ache of knowing that if he hadn't been on this plane, none of it would have changed. If he hadn't stood up, they would have landed thirsty and unseen, and no one would have known or cared. The curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin swayed slightly as a crew member stepped through to check on the passengers one last time. People were collecting their belongings now, folding up blankets, reaching into overhead bins. But in 2A and 2B there was no rush. Yvette passed by again and paused, her eyes soft. "Landing in about 10, she said with a small nod. "Thank you for your grace." Thomas offered a polite smile. "Thank you for not pretending." Yvette smiled in return, then moved on. Leona turned to Miles. Her voice was quiet, yet filled with something that had been rising all flight. "Do you think people even realize they're doing it?" she asked. The ignoring, the assuming. Miles rested his elbows on his knees, fingers laced together. He considered her question for a long moment. "Some do," he said finally. "Some know exactly what they're doing, but most, I think they don't think at all. They've spent so long being served that they think service belongs to them." Leona looked at him with a tired sadness. "So what now?" "We get off. Go home. And they just keep going." He met her gaze.
We keep going too. But not quietly. Thomas reached for Leona's hand again. This time she didn't hide the emotion in her eyes. Neither of them needed to. Not anymore. The plane began to lower, its nose dipping ever so slightly. The lights dimmed to a warm hue, and the city lights below started to sparkle faintly beneath the clouds. As the aircraft rumbled through its descent, that familiar soft tension returned, like the air pressing gently against the cabin walls, as if reminding everyone they were still miles above the ground. Leona leaned back, her eyes drifting toward the front of the cabin. Samantha stood there now, posture stiffer than before. She wasn't smiling, not the way she had earlier. She kept looking toward the cockpit, then down the aisle, avoiding row 2 altogether. Leona didn't hate her. She wasn't even angry anymore. But she knew, deeply, quietly, that Samantha had felt invincible before today. That to her, neglect wasn't cruelty. It was just routine. And that's what made it dangerous. Because people like Samantha didn't shout slurs. They didn't slam doors. They simply skipped you, looked past you, spoke over you. And that kind of erasure didn't show up on camera or in bold letters. It showed up in tray tables left empty, names never asked, and glasses that never got filled. And if Miles hadn't walked up that aisle... Leona closed her eyes for a moment, just long enough to feel the weight behind that truth. Then she opened them, steadied herself, and reached for her son's hand. She didn't squeeze it, just held it. A quiet thank you in the way only a mother could give. The plane jolted slightly as it began to level out again. The city below grew clearer now. Rows of houses, streetlights flickering like stars. They were almost home. And though nothing about this flight had gone as expected, one thing was certain. They would not be getting off this plane the same way they boarded it. The wheels touched the runway with a low, steady rumble, a sound that usually felt routine, almost forgettable. But not this time. Not to Miles, not to Leona, not to Thomas. This time, it felt like punctuation. Like a line had been drawn underneath everything that had happened in the air. A quiet underline beneath every ignored glance, every small dignity withheld, every moment they had waited for what others received without asking. The plane slowed, the brakes engaging with a dull groan, the forward pull nudging passengers against their belts. Thomas gripped the armrest, not because of the landing, but because he was preparing himself. Preparing to walk through that jet bridge with his back straight and his voice steady. Preparing to act like the last 3 hours hadn't stripped something from him in front of his son. But it had. And he wasn't sure how long it would take to name what that something was. Leona unclipped her belt and let her hands rest in her lap. Her palms were damp. Her throat was still dry, even though the glass of water had long been finished. She wasn't thirsty anymore, not in that way. But there was a hollow place just under her collarbone, a place that still felt cracked open, like the shame had entered and made itself at home. Not loud shame, not the kind that comes from shouting or insults. This was a quieter kind, the kind that wears pearls and keeps a soft voice and still walks off the plane feeling smaller than when she walked on. Miles stood first, reaching into the overhead bin to grab his mother's bag. He moved carefully, without show. He didn't want to make this a statement. He didn't want to make this dramatic. But everything about this moment was already charged. Passengers in front of them stood as well. A few glanced over, some with curiosity, one with a tight smile. But no one said anything. Not the man from 1C, not the younger woman who had watched the tray incident unfold from across the aisle. No one. Samantha stood by the front exit now, arms folded neatly in front of her. Her hair, still perfectly pinned, no longer swayed with confidence. Her expression was blank. Not apologetic, not confrontational, just blank. Like the face of someone who realized, too late, that there had been consequences for what she didn't say, for what she didn't do. Thomas stepped out into the aisle. He took his time. His knees ached and his pride still hurt, but his posture didn't falter. He reached back for Leona's bag and handed it to her gently, with the same small kindness he had always shown, long before this flight ever happened. Leona paused before stepping out. She looked at the seat she had occupied for nearly 4 hours. It looked like any other seat. Leather, clean, ordinary. But she knew it had changed her. Just a little. Not in the way that left scars, but in the way that makes you remember. Miles followed behind them, his face unreadable. Not cold, not detached, just quiet. The way someone walks after doing something necessary. As they reached the door, Samantha offered the same line she had given every other passenger. "Thank you for flying with us." Leona met her eyes, held them. "We were here the whole time," she said, her voice steady. "I just hope you remember that." Samantha didn't reply. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. And in that silence, Leona turned and walked forward. The jet bridge was cool, the air thinner, sharper somehow. They stepped into it one by one. Thomas, Leona, Miles, each with their own weight, each with a different kind of silence. At the gate, 2 uniformed airline officials stood waiting. One man in a suit, another in a blazer with the airline's crest. The man in the blazer stepped forward, a tablet in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Harris?" he asked. "And Agent Harris?" Thomas raised an eyebrow. "That's us." The man nodded quickly. "We've been informed of the situation. We're here to apologize in person and to offer transportation to your hotel. Additionally, a formal review of the flight crew has already been initiated." Leona didn't nod. She didn't thank him, not yet. She had learned to listen first, to wait and see what action looked like, not what apology sounded like. Miles stepped slightly in front of his parents. "I've documented everything," he said, "and a report is being filed. This won't be handled internally and quietly. That's not how change works." The man cleared his throat. "Understood." Thomas looked at his son, then at his wife. He reached for Leona's hand once more. "You did good," he whispered. Leona smiled. Not wide, not showy. Just enough to say she heard him. Just enough to say she agreed. They walked together now, as a unit. Through the airport, past the quiet stairs, toward whatever waited next. And behind them, on a flight log no one thought would matter, 3 seats, 2A, 2B, and 27F, had been marked for review. Because for the first time in a long time, someone had noticed. And this time the silence wasn't going to stay where it was. Outside, the night had settled deep and quiet over the city. The airport windows reflected soft halos of light from the ceiling, and beyond the glass, taxiing planes crawled like shadows across the runway, their wingtips blinking red and white. The terminal buzzed with low movement, rollers clicking across tile, quiet voices, the occasional announcement echoing from overhead. But for Thomas, Leona, and Miles, everything around them felt oddly distant, muted, like they had stepped out of something louder and now found themselves inside the aftermath. They sat in a private waiting lounge now, just off the main corridor. A gesture from the airline. "For your comfort," the agent had said. It was quiet, clean, filled with leather chairs and bowls of wrapped mints no one touched. It wasn't comfort they needed. It was clarity, and perhaps something no airline had ever offered. Acknowledgement without excuse. Leona stared at her reflection in the dark glass of the window. She barely recognized it at first. The woman looking back at her was upright, composed, hair still neatly pinned, but her eyes were tired, not from the flight but from the weight that came when you carried yourself with grace in rooms that had already decided you weren't worthy of it. She didn't cry. She hadn't. And maybe she wouldn't. That part of her had been buried somewhere between decades of holding it in and quietly surviving rooms just like this one. Thomas sat beside her, his hands clasped loosely in his lap, elbows resting on the arms of the chair. His posture was straighter than usual, as if sitting any less tall would be giving someone permission to say this hadn't mattered. But it had. He felt it deep in the center of his chest. A tired ache that wasn't physical. A sort of ache that only comes from watching your wife be diminished in public and having no clean place to put the rage without making things worse. He glanced at her now,
then looked at his son. Miles was pacing slowly across the back of the lounge, not with anger, but with the quiet energy of a man who had held it together when it counted and now didn't know what to do with what was left. He had taken off his hoodie, now wearing just a plain white shirt. No badge, no title. Just a man in a room, still holding the weight of everything his parents wouldn't have said if he hadn't stood up. "I keep thinking," Miles said softly, breaking the stillness. "How many other times it's happened like this? To people who don't have a badge, who don't say anything, who just sit there." Thomas didn't respond right away. He just let the words hang in the air. Because he knew the truth in them. He had lived it. "It happens more often than they think," Thomas finally said. "And it always ends the same way. Someone else gets the benefit of the doubt." Leona turned from the window. "I don't want people to feel sorry for us," she said. "I want them to think twice next time. That's all, just think." Miles nodded, still walking. "That's the thing, though. People like Samantha, they don't think they're doing anything wrong. That's why it's so dangerous. It's not loud. It's quiet, professional, controlled." Leona folded her hands over her bag. "It's polished neglect." That phrase sat heavy in the room. Polished neglect. Not hateful, not cruel, just smooth and practiced, invisible to everyone else except the ones it touches. There was a knock on the glass door. The airline's regional director stepped in, followed by a woman from their internal ethics office. Both wore the same strained, apologetic smiles. They sat down across from the family with careful posture, not too relaxed, not too stiff. "We appreciate your time," the director began. "We understand that what happened today doesn't reflect the values we aim to uphold. A full investigation into the crew's conduct is already underway, and we are prepared to take appropriate action. We're also reviewing all previous customer complaints connected to the involved staff." He paused, watching their reactions. But there was no outrage to soothe, no shouting to calm, just quiet. Leona spoke first. "We didn't ask for anything special, just what was promised, just what everyone else received." "We know," said the ethics officer. Her voice was softer, and her eyes more human. "And we're not here to defend it. We're here because we failed to prevent it." Miles leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees. "Words don't fix systems," he said. "Accountability does. Policy does. Training that doesn't stop at legal compliance but goes deeper, to how people are treated when no one is watching. We're prepared to bring you in as an outside advisor," the woman said, "to help us build that kind of training, not just for this crew but across our entire first-class service team." Leona blinked. "Why us?" "Because most people stay quiet," she answered. "You didn't." There was a long pause. Thomas finally spoke, voice low but firm. "We didn't plan on making an example of anyone, but if being noticed this time helps someone else not be ignored, maybe it was worth the hurt." The director stood. "We'll put it in writing," he said. "We want to get this right." After they left, the silence returned, but this time it felt different. Not empty, just full of thought. Leona reached for Miles's hand and held it. "You were the right kind of loud," she said softly. Miles looked down at their fingers, then up at her. "I learned from watching you stay strong." Thomas smiled faintly. "And now we know. Next time, we won't wait." Outside, a new flight lifted from the runway into the night sky, its lights blinking in the dark, unaware of the quiet, lasting shift that had taken place in a corner lounge below. The black car pulled up slowly in front of the hotel, its headlights washing across the brick entrance and bouncing softly off the glass doors. A bellhop stepped forward, his face neutral, professional, already opening the door before the vehicle came to a full stop. Miles stepped out first, stretched his shoulders gently, then turned to help Leona as she gathered her bag. Thomas followed close behind, his steps careful, knees stiff from the hours of sitting. The hotel lobby was warm, quiet. It smelled faintly of lemon polish and something floral from a distant vase. No loud music, no crowds, just calm. A man at the front desk recognized their name,
nodded quickly and handed them a room key without fuss. No extra questions, no signatures. For once, the process was smooth, uneventful. They didn't speak as they rode the elevator to the 6th floor. The soft hum of the motor, the muted chime at each passing floor. Everything around them gave space to the stillness they carried. It wasn't a silence of avoidance anymore. It was reflection, a quiet, worn-out kind of peace that came after an emotional storm. When the doors opened, they stepped into the hallway lined with soft lighting and thick carpet. Leona walked slowly, her fingers trailing the edge of the wall as they neared their room. Miles followed behind, keeping his distance, not because he wasn't part of them, but because he wanted to give them a moment to be just themselves again. Just Thomas and Leona, husband and wife. Survivors of something invisible and real. Inside the room, Leona placed her purse gently on the dresser. She didn't sit yet. She walked over to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly. The city stretched out before her, quiet and shimmering under a blanket of lights. Cars moved like fireflies along the dark veins of streets below. Somewhere out there, people were laughing, dining, living their lives untouched by the kind of ache she now carried in her chest. Thomas sat on the edge of the bed and slowly untied his shoes. Each knot felt heavier than usual. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The weight between them didn't need words. It had spoken loudly enough all day. Miles stood at the door, one hand on the frame. "I'll head to my room," he said quietly. "You both need rest." Leona turned, looking at him for a long second. "Wait." He paused. She walked to him, slowly, then wrapped her arms around him. Not tight, not desperate, just firm, lasting, like a memory being placed carefully into the pages of a photo album no one else would ever see. "You gave us back something today," she said softly. "Something we've been told for years, to accept going without." Miles didn't know how to respond. Not with words. So he didn't. He just held her a little longer. Thomas joined them at the door, resting his hand on Miles's shoulder. "You reminded me," he said, "that strength isn't always in what we hold back. Sometimes it's in knowing when to act, and doing it without yelling." Miles looked between them. "I just couldn't let it go. Not this time." Leona nodded. "You didn't just stand for us. You stood for all the times we couldn't speak." There was no applause, no audience. Just the soft hum of the air conditioner, the quiet glow of the bedside lamp, and the slow settling of 3 hearts that had carried too much weight for too long. Miles said goodnight and stepped into the hallway. He didn't rush. The door closed softly behind him, but he stood there for a moment, eyes closed, back against the wall. And he thought about everything. The call buttons unanswered, the looks that pretended not to see, the glass of water that came too late. He thought about his parents, and all the people like them, who had been taught to endure silently in places designed to overlook them. Then he thought about how this time it had been different, not because justice roared, but because someone had simply said, "No more." Back inside the room, Thomas pulled the curtains closed, and Leona finally sat. Her body ached in the way it always did after a long day, but something deeper had shifted inside her, not healed, not forgotten, but acknowledged. She took Thomas's hand in hers. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Because even though this wasn't the flight they had imagined, even though the pain was real and still fresh, they knew something else had taken flight that day. Not loud, but unshakable. And sometimes, that's how change begins. With someone watching, someone standing, someone refusing to sit quietly when dignity is quietly denied. And as the night deepened around them, one truth stayed with them both. They had raised a son who didn't wait to be told they mattered. He already knew, and now so did the world. If this story touched you, give it a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more real and powerful stories like this one.